Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and start taking a look at some of the fundamentals that it's going to take in order to start shooting photography with a film camera. Basically, we're going to start off with a light meter, which basically what the light meter is going to tell us is if what's within our frame that we're looking at is over or underexposed. It's going to look at the ISO, it's going to look at the aperture setting, and it's going to look at our shutter speed in order to balance all three of those things. And it thinks about what is in our frame and what's within our viewfinder, and it averages that out and makes a comparison between that and what's called 50% gray. Pretty common sense. It's 50% white, 50% black, and then you would have 50% gray. So the idea behind the light meter, though, is that it's going to lie to you at certain times. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go ahead and talk about what a simple light meter would look like. I'm going to use the K1000 as an example here and how that light meter would look in the camera. So, draw a simple picture here. And start out with our viewfinder. And in the right-hand section of our viewfinder right here, we're actually going to have a little bar that comes up. And sometimes there's a minus and a plus. We'll just go ahead and assume that there is a minus and a plus, depending on what camera you're going to be using. So, in other cameras, like the 7D, it's going to be a completely different setup for our light meter, and it's going to help us understand a little bit better what the differences between all the different settings are. On a Nikon, it'd be different, and it's just something that you're going to have to look up from camera to camera to camera, especially on film cameras. I've seen them, as simple as two little LEDs to tell you if it's light or too dark. And then I've seen them as like bars like this, which is an analog little graph, more or less, to tell you exactly what's going on. So the best thing to do is to research it and understand that the light meter will tell you overexposed or underexposed. So this guy right here, let's say this little bar in our K1000 is smack dab in the middle. Well, good deal. We actually have a perfectly exposed photo according to the light meter. And what that means is it's going to look at everything in the frame, as previously mentioned, and average that to 50% gray as best as it can. If it can average it to 50% gray, it's going to put the light meter bar right there in the center. Let's say it's, a little bit above 50% gray or something of the sort. And it's too light. Well, it's going to have the bar pop up there at the top. And it's going to tell us generally what's going to be light or too dark. And what would happen in that situation is you would use, on this camera, just the shutter speed and the aperture in order to adjust your exposure to make sure that it was either back balanced, or you would know what you were shooting, like let's say you're shooting up against snow, in order to try to use this to inform your shot. So the other direction would obviously be underexposed. If the photo's too dark, you would want to open up the aperture or have a slower shutter speed to allow more light to come into the camera. So within that little frame there, you're going to want to balance it. And like I said, it's different from camera to camera. And the other thing that we had touched on was that it's going to lie to you sometimes. So let's talk about a situation of shooting straight on in the snow. I could be shooting a rabbit off in the distance in the snow, and my light meter is always going to tell me, okay, you're in way too bright conditions. Well, that might be true if it's averaging everything to 50% gray. But if you think about it this way, in that shot, since there's so much white and since there's so much reflection that's white, it's going to not average to 50% gray and still be a correct photo. So the idea is your light meter is always going to lie to you depending on what you're shooting against. And this sort of setting right here, I'd go ahead and trust my light meter. It's going to be very accurate just due to the shadows and the lighting and everything else. Sometimes if you're in a studio and you're shooting up against a white backdrop or a black backdrop, there's a lot of different situations where it'll just give you information that's not necessarily correct or wouldn't necessarily look balanced by the light meter. But even in those situations, you can use where it's ending up as a tool to figure out, okay, am I going to be overexposed or underexposed? And in those situations, we're going to use a technique probably called bracketing. So bracketing is a very simple technique which, on this camera right here, let's say I'm shooting a photo and I have it at f-stop. Okay, so it's at 8, and I'm not exactly sure. It's that snow situation where, okay, I got that first shot. Maybe I'm going to pop it over to the left and take it at 11, and then I'm going to take it at 5.6 as well. And you'll see the light meter adjusts itself for each one of those different settings, and it'll go up and down a little bit in order to help you calibrate that shot. Now, you can also bracket with shutter speed as well, or even ISO. It's really whatever you want to modify, you're going to go to the left and go to the right. On digital cameras like the 7D, or I used to have a 30D, basically they're going to help you by having specific settings for bracketing automatically. So the camera itself could be intelligent enough to take 3 shots when it needs to take 3 shots, which is a pretty neat feature. Another thing about bracketing that a lot of people use it for is what's called HDR, or high definition realism, I believe is what that stands for. Somebody can prove me wrong. But basically what that's going to do is it's going to capture the lights, the mids, and the darks as well. And you can actually use software these days, or certain darkroom techniques like here, in order to merge or splice all 3 of those photos together as if they were on a tripod, or if they were on a tripod or from a fixed location, and everything was still. So by using those sort of techniques, you can get a lot of really interesting effects and get more dynamic ranges from your photos. An idea of when to use that would be is if you're on a tripod and you're shooting an outdoor scene where your foreground is darker, your middle ground is a little bit lighter, and then your sky would be really light. You're not going to get the definition in the sky without losing the definition of your foreground, and you're not going to get the definition of your foreground without losing your definition of the sky. And the biggest thing with that is by stitching 2 of those photos together, you're going to be able to get both of your foreground and your sky into that shot. So that's a couple things about bracketing. You can use it to do a lot of different things, and especially for beginning photographers, I would highly recommend for your first few rolls of film or your first few times out to bracket a lot of your shots. And the reason is because you're going to get a good feeling for when is that light meter going to lie to me and not. And what is the actual effect if I'm setting different settings on my camera. You know, if you're shooting a digital camera for the first time, knowing the differences between the different levels of ISO is going to be really important. And regardless of how well calibrated cameras are, I feel that those values change from camera to camera, or from different brand of film to different brand of film. It's all up in the air, and the only way to really get a good feel for it is to practice. And bracketing is a great time. So the other thing about going out and shooting your first few rolls of film is on a digital camera, it'll record the settings that you took that photo with. On a traditional film camera, you're not going to have that. Likely. Sometimes it'll include it in the exposure on some more modern cameras, which is interesting, but you're really not going to have it. What I would do is I would keep a log where you would have what shot and what number of exposure is it, and what did I set the f-stop at, and what did I set the shutter speed at. And this will help you figure out your camera a lot better and a lot more quick. Rather than shooting from the hip every time, you'll know, okay, I have this certain situation that I've done before, and knowing the numbers for your camera as far as what it's going, and how those numbers are going to react in different lighting situations is really where you're going to get better and better at photography. I shoot full manual on almost all of my cameras. The reason is because I like to have utter control over it, and I go out in the get-go and I do exactly that. I take a lot of bracketed photos as soon as I get a new camera in order to figure out what this camera really is capable of and how does this camera react to light. So, cool. The next thing that we're going to talk about is rewinding and loading film. So the first thing on this guy is, let's go ahead and look how we would rewind the film. So right now we're at 0, but let's assume that we're at 24 or 36 exposures. And we have a couple of different films here. I've got Ilford Delta 400. This is a 36 exposure, it'll tell you right on the box. And here's some Kodak Gold, which is a 24 set of exposure. And that'll differ from film to film. And it's a good thing to know as you're shooting how many exposures you're working with and how much you're going to have until you have to do a roll swap out. So basically, to rewind the film, there's going to be a button at the bottom of the camera that releases this guy right here and actually allows in the camera these guys to roll backwards. And the reason that there's a lock on that is so that you don't just end up, rewinding right away. So, cool. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but imagine that there's some film in there. We filled it up with 36 rolls and we need to rewind. Well, there is a nice little arrow on the top of there and an R to help you rewind, and this little lever flips right out, and then you'll hit that lock in the bottom, and then you'll follow that arrow. Always follow the arrow, because you can screw up a canister of film in a lot of exposures if you don't. It can get threaded out of the canister and things like that, which you can redeem that by taking it into a dark room, but in 2013, access to a dark room is pretty rare. So basically, you want to make sure that you're rewinding your film in the right direction. And when you're rewinding it, it'll get to a point where you'll feel it release, and it'll suck itself all the way back up into the canister, which is exactly what you want to have happen. So when we open up some of this film here, let's go ahead and grab 400 ISO Kodak Ultramax. This is really standard film. Great stuff to start off with. This is 24 exposures. And we're going to look at loading the film, and we're going to kind of get an idea of how it's going to look when it comes out. So when you're loading the film and you get film out of the canister the first time, it's going to have this little tail on it, and this tail is designed to help you load the film correctly into the camera. And all these little holes on here are going to fit into the sprockets in the back of the camera as you're rewinding that film. So once you finish rewinding it, this little tail is actually going to get sucked back into the canister, and it's going to get pop in here, and you're not going to be able to remove it. Now, the idea behind that is you don't want to necessarily have that sitting out, and that's the release that you'll feel is once this pulls back through, there's you can feel a little bit of force that's holding that. So, to load film into a K1000, we're going to pull this guy up, and right now, make sure that our exposure is out. So pull that guy open, and there's going to be a very clear way to pull this in. Now, on this far left sprocket or receiver, there's going to be a hole where you can fit this this tab into, and basically that's perfectly the same size. So, and this guy is a slot for this top section right here. So you'll be able to know what direction the film is supposed to go by looking what direction this guy's at. So we're going to pull this guy straight out, and we're going to grab it and put it into that hole. And I forgot that this guy actually will come back down, and you're going to rotate it until you feel it catch. There we go, within that. Now, because let me grab another roll of film really quick here to illustrate this. On the top there's two little tabs in that film that basically a couple of teeth are going to pop down from this spindle here, so that it can drive this center shaft of the film that you have. So always keep your film in a canister. Always a good idea. Alrighty. So back to what we're doing here. So we've got this guy. It's now in here. We've got 24 exposures, and we've got the end fitted into the tab. And what I'm going to go ahead and do here is pull this guy back a couple of times, like I'm taking a shot with my camera, and then click it and do the same. And eventually you're going to see this get threaded over these sprockets, and I just kind of helped it out a little bit there. There we go. So you'll see those sprockets sticking right up through there, and this is rolling right in there. So perfect. Now we're able to close our camera up, take another shot, and we're going to do a couple more shots. And the reason that is because we want to get it to the point, we're going to put that down too, we want to get it to the point where it comes up to 0 on this. Because every bit of film that we just expose to the light is going to be ruined, if you will. So you want to pull that over the spindle, and it'll keep exposing that until we close our film or our camera body. And once we close our camera body, we're going to take a few more shots in order to get the exposures over to the spindle, so that we're not to ruin film, basically. So on this guy, we're now at exposure 0, which is exactly where we need to be. And that should be all that we need to do in order to get that camera loaded up. So this camera is now loaded up with film, ready to start taking some shots. So next thing is let's talk about getting our lens cleaned really quick. So this guy, not too dirty, but a little bit. So the first thing that I'm going to do on a lens is there's a couple of different ways to skin this cat, and people might complain about how I do this. So take this all with a grain of salt. There's a lot of different videos and a lot of different stuff out there. I've seen a few of them, and I kind of have my own method. So I like to take a brush and get in there and dust off all the dust that I possibly can from the surface of that lens. And the reason I'm doing this is so that once I take the wet cloth that has a little bit of alcohol solution on it, which they sell lens cleaning solution, I'm going to shake that out. And then I've got a microfiber cloth here, which these guys you can get from any camera store or glasses store. This one actually came from a Samsung Galaxy tablet. So good enough though, it doesn't matter, just as long as it's a microfiber cloth. I'm going to take this and I'm going to put a little drop right there on the lens, or on the microfiber cloth, and I'm just going to go ahead and start lightly wiping that guy down. A lot of people like to do this with gloves. I'm not a big fan of doing it with gloves because this is a pretty old camera. I'm not too concerned. And then we're going to go ahead and just take a dry part of that cloth and kind of polish the lens up a little bit. And get her all around the edges, and I use my fingernail to kind of get it along the edges there. And we're good to go. So now we've got the lens clean, and you think, okay, let's throw the cap right back on. Not so much. The biggest importance about getting these guys clean is getting the lens cap clean, and nobody really thinks about that. And that's one of the biggest things that people screw up with. So what I like to do is take a brush in here and just kind of get any sort of particles out of the lens cap. And this one's brand new, so it's not that big of a deal. I doubt there's anything really in it. And here's a little blower brush, which basically you can use this to do the same thing, kind of blow any particles of dust that you would see within this out. Getting a bigger blower brush is a good thing. I believe they're called rockets, and they're big bulbs. You can really get in there and get a whole bunch of stuff out of there, but for a beginner photographer, these things are just good enough. So go ahead and put that right back on there. Now the next thing I'm going to warn against is do not use any chemical compressed air. The reason is because you can really screw up a lens's coating with the different chemicals that are within that. You can really screw up things within the camera body as well. It's just not a good idea in order to use those to get dust out of the camera. So this camera right now as it sits is perfectly ready to start taking photography with it.